In our world today, masculinity is challenged, and that is an understatement. It seems like everything that is wrong with this world is the fault and the blame of someone who is of a masculine gender. Now, right up front, men can be bozos. Men can be jerks. Men can be unthoughtful, and men can be considerate. Men can be arrogant. Men can be greedy. Men can be cruel, and men can be mean. But so is Satan. And so can women. Men don't have a patent pending on those vices. But when we look at how the Bible presents a man, I want to look at how God describes His ideal man. How would you describe an ideal man? At the end of the lesson, I want to know, would you think about an ideal man the way that God describes an ideal man? And God describes Job as more righteous than all. And Job, I think, is God's ideal man. Job doesn't get the attention that Abraham and Moses do. However, when God speaks, Job gets more attention than Abraham and Moses do. Because when Ezekiel spoke in chapter 14, twice in that chapter, Ezekiel speaks of Noah, Job, and Daniel, and says of them that there are none more righteous than they. Notice, Moses and Abraham weren't remembered by Ezekiel, but Noah, Job, and Daniel are. Job was an anti-Semitic who lived prior to the time of Moses and Abraham. He is before Moses, who records the book of Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. When you think about Job, we generally shift our minds to the suffering and the pain. And the fact is, Job's story is a story that is common to mankind. It's a story of triumph. It's a story of pain. It's a story of suffering. It's a story again of conquering. It's a deep story of great faith, a story of great trials. In fact, when you turn to chapter 29 of the book of Job, this is Job remembering the good old days. When you turn to chapter 30, this is Job remembering the bad old days. But when you come to chapter 31 and you read verses 5 and 6, he says, "If I have walked with falsehood, or if my foot has hastened to deceit, let me be weighed on honest scales, that God may know my integrity." He appeals not to the good old days and not to the bad old days, but he appeals to being weighed by God. And so if we were to ask the question, what is the picture of an ideal man? And thus answer the question, what is a man? We look beginning in the book of Job. The first thing that I would suggest to you that describes an ideal man is he does what is right regardless of the circumstances. And for that, I would reference you back to chapter 1. In chapter 1, when the great trials have taken place with Job, he speaks and he says, "Shall we not receive good things at the hand of God and also receive the adversity? And in that, if we receive the good, shall we not also receive the bad and not curse God?" Here we have Job speaking in this great trial that he has undertaken. Things began well with Job, but they did not stay well with Job. And there are a number of things that Job doesn't understand, and Job breaks when Satan finally brings his friends. And the burden of the conversation of his friends began to crack his resolve. He doesn't understand what's taking place. In fact, Job never really is provided the answer of what is taking place in his life. But Job is a man that, regardless of whether he has the answers or not, is a man that was determined to do right regardless of the circumstances. And the fact of the matter is, that's where we live life. There are a number of things that are going to happen in our lives to the which we will never satisfactorily find an answer. But the resolve of Job was that regardless of whether he had the answers or not, it was not going to deter his trust in God, and it was not going to prevent his doing what was right, regardless of the circumstances. The second thing that we find from the book of Job, as we turn back to chapter 31, is we find that he was pure and chaste. See this beginning in verse 1 of chapter 31. He says, I've made a covenant with my eyes. Why then should I look upon a young woman? I've made a covenant with my eyes. Why should I look upon a young woman? Here you see the chastity. You see the purity of Job. You see the loyalty. You see the commitment of Job. Job wasn't just some hick from the backwoods who had no moral compass. Job was pure, and Job was chaste because he chose to be pure and chaste. Men don't just wake up one morning and decide to get impure. It's a choice they do not make to be pure. And Job made the choice that that's what he was going to be. He was going to be a man regardless of what was before him. He was not going to find himself bound in the lust for another woman. And kissing cousin to that was that he made a covenant to keep his promises. Look at chapter 31. Chapter 31 and read beginning in verse 9. He says, if my heart has been enticed by a woman, or if I have lurked at my neighbor's door, then let my wife grind for another, and let others bow down over her. For what would be wickedness? Yes, it would be iniquity deserving judgment. For that would be a fire that consumes to destruction and would not root out all my increase. As far as Job is concerned, it is unfathomable. It is unthinkable that he would find himself lying with his neighbor's wife. He had made a covenant that he would remain pure and that he would remain chaste, and he had made a covenant that he would keep his promises with his wife. In fact, you find in chapter 7 that young man that is foolish, that is hanging around the corner from hell, that is in the wrong place at the wrong place at the right time. Here you have this young man and this woman that is going to play the part of the harlot, looks out her window and she sees him, and he's naive, he's foolish, he's inexperienced in life. And in the end of that very experience, when she seduces him with her words, with her kisses, with atmosphere, with prayer, with religion, it comes down and says he was like an ox that was led to the slaughter, playing the part of the fool. That's not where you're going to find Job. Job is not going to be that man. Job is a man who's going to respect the covenant that he's made with his wife. He's a man that's going to respect the promises that he's made with his wife. In fact, he has said here, if my heart has been enticed by a woman, or if I have lurked at my neighbor's door, let her grind for another, let her seek another. He said, I'm not going to take that which Proverbs 5 verses 21 through 23 speaks and says, I'm not going to take that which I have vowed and committed to another, made covenant with another, and share that with a strange woman, nor am I going to be enraptured with her love. I'm not going to be intoxicated with her love. I'm going to be overwhelmed, I'm going to be intoxicated and ravished with the youth, the wife of my youth. He says, I'm not going to be like the one who lets waters run the street and share those waters with another. I'm not going to share the one. I'm not going to share myself to become one with a harlot. I'm not going to violate the covenant. I'm not going to violate the promise that I have made. I'm going to be a man who keeps my word. I'm going to be a man who keeps my promises. Then third, we see that he is truthful and thoughtful in his dealing with others. Look at chapter 31, verses 5 and 6 again. If I have walked with falsehood, or if my foot has hastened to deceit, let me be weighed on honest scales, that God may know my integrity. Do you remember one of the 7 things that God hates? A lying tongue. And Job says, deceit will not be found in my mouth. In fact, the psalmist will use these words in chapter 34, and Peter will echo these words when he seeks about seeking life and having good days. He says to do good unto others and let no deceit be found in your tongue. And Job is not going to be a man whose tongue is going to be found deceitful. He's not going to be a man whose tongue is found with scorn. He's going to be a man whose tongue is found with truthfulness. He's a man who's going to be thoughtful in his dealings with others. Look at chapter 13 again. Look again at verses 15 and 16. He said, Did he who made me in the womb make me, and did not the same one fashion us in the womb? If I have kept the poor from their desire and caused their eyes and the widow to fall. What he's saying is, I'm not only going to be thoughtful to my dealing with others, I'm going to be compassionate with my enemies, and in doing so, I'm going to be fair and just and a man of integrity with them. Look at the 31st Psalm for just a moment. Look at Psalms chapter 31. Look at Psalm chapter 31 and look at verses 38 through 40. And listen again to how he will describe himself in his dealings with others. Psalm chapter 31, beginning in verse... Well, you know, when you write it down and you get it wrong, that's really bad. And so let's look at Proverbs chapter 10. Let's look at Proverbs chapter 10 and verse 18. Proverbs chapter 10 and verse 18. He says, whoever hides his hatred has lying lips, and whoever spreads slander is a fool. Job will talk about the one that bears falsehood. And in doing so, he says, I'm not going to play that part. Job is a man who is truthful and thoughtful and is dealing with others. But I want you to see, he's also compassionate with his enemies. Look back again in Job chapter 31. Look again in Job chapter 31. And this time look at verse 29 and verse 30. Job chapter 21, verses 31, chapter 29, verse 29 and verse 30. If I rejoiced at the destruction of him who hated me, or lifted myself up with evil and found him, indeed I have not allowed my mouth to sin by making a curse against his soul. Job realized that all of creation came from God. And he realized that even his respect for the poor was necessary. He said, I'm not going to be a man that takes advantage of others. I'm not going to be a man that cheats others. He said, I'm not only going to be compassionate and treat those of my family and those I love with integrity, I'm also going to be one who is fair in my dealing and just in my dealing with others as well. He's going to be compassionate toward his enemies. But I want you to see again that he's going to be gentle and forbearing, selfless, and free from vengeance. This time look back at Job chapter 6 and verse 26. Job chapter 6 and verse 26. Here's the occasion in which his friends are speaking to him. He said, do you intend to rebuke my words and the speeches of a desperate one which are as wind? Job is saying, do you intend to sit here and pick everything I've said to pieces? Are you going to sit there and you're not going to listen to me? I'm trying to tell you something. He's saying, I don't agree with what you said, but the problem is, I believe what you said, but it doesn't jive. The righteous do suffer. And you're saying that the righteous wouldn't suffer. That's not right. And here what you're doing is you're sitting here and you're just parsing every word I've got. I wonder, do we sometimes sit in the seat of these three friends? James will talk about in chapter 1 and verse 19 to be swift to hear and slow to speak and slow to wrath. But I wonder sometimes if we're not guilty, if I'm not guilty of being swift to speak and quick to hear. I'm quick to speak and really should be listening. We need to stop sometimes and listen to the person that's hurting. And hearing God's ideal man, he says of his friends, will you also sit here and just pick me apart? Then I want you to see something else. Look at chapter 31. Back in Job chapter 31, I want you to see again, he's the spiritual leader of his family. Look at verses 33 and 34. He said, if I've covered my transgressions as Adam, by hiding my iniquity in my bosom, because I feared the great multitude and dreaded the contempt of families, so that I kept my silence and did not go out of the door. Notice he talks about if I have covered my transgression. You remember in chapter 1, chapter 2, when Job would offer sacrifice for his family. Here Job is concerned about the influence he's going to have over his family to be their spiritual leader. If I've covered my sin as transgression as Adam, if I've covered my iniquity, if I have ignored that, if I've somehow excused that. But it's not just his family he's concerned about. If you turn back to chapter 29, we'll not read verses 7 through 25, but I want you to notice a couple of things that are said throughout this verse. Job is also concerned about his spiritual influence in his community. He said, when I went out to the gate by the city, when I took my seat in the open square. Then he comes down and says, men, verse 21, men listened to me and waited and kept silence for my counsel. And after my words, they did not speak again, and my speech settled on them as dew. They waited for me as the rain. They opened their mouth wide as for the spring rain. Job is concerned about his spiritual influence with his family. He's concerned about his spiritual influence on his community. But that should not be strange to us. If you turn back to the book of Isaiah chapter 40. Isaiah chapter 40, when you find that this is God's man, it's no wonder you would find him that way because he's trying to be like God. Look at Isaiah chapter 40, verse 10. Behold, the Lord God shall come with a strong hand, and his arms shall rule for him. Behold, his reward is with him, and his work before him. He will feed his flock like a shepherd. He will gather the lambs with his arms and carry them in his bosom, and gently lead those who are with the young. What's Job doing? Is it strange that here you have God's man who's going to speak the truth? How could it be any different if he's God's man? Because God cannot lie. How would it be different with God's man that he would not be a man of honor because God is above all righteous? How it could be different if he's not God's man, if he would also be the spiritual leader of his family when God is strong and the chief shepherd of all. And what he's saying is, I'm trying to shepherd my family and also shepherd my community. But also I want you to see back in Job chapter 42, verses 5 through 6, the impact this has on Job. Job is a man, as I said in the beginning, that has tried the crucible of pain. And Job is a man that, like his friends, sometimes speaks rashly. Sometimes Job is a man that, like his friends, complain to God and doesn't understand what's happening. But in all of that, Job never lays aside his ultimate determination and resolve to stay true to God. He's made that determination in the beginning. And look at what happens in chapter 42, verses 5 and 6. He said, I've heard of you by the hearing of the ear, but now my eye sees you. Therefore I abhor myself and repent in dust and ashes. And what you see here, you see the humility and reverence of Job. In all of this, God allowed Job that approach to him, that allowed that complaint. But in none of this does Job lose his humility, his reverence for God. And he ultimately learns that while he might not have the answer to everything, God does. And while he may not understand what's going on and doesn't see behind the scenes, he says, in my complaint and in my request, if I had 5 minutes with God, I could straighten him out. He says, I have spoken as one of the foolish ones. Ultimately, you see his reverence and his humility for God. But then I want you to see also that he knows the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. Look in chapter 28. In chapter 28 and verse 28. And to man he said, behold, the fear of the Lord, and that is wisdom. To depart from evil is understanding. That echoes Proverbs chapter 1 and verse 7, that the beginning of fear is knowledge. The beginning of fear. And don't dumb down that word fear. He's not saying the beginning of respect, the beginning of reverence of knowledge. What he's saying is the beginning of absolute terror, the beginning of absolute horror before God is knowledge. And the knowledge of the fact that He is an awesome and fearful God. That yes, He's a God of mercy, but He also is a God that is awesome and a God that is to be feared, that is a consuming fire. And here in chapter 28, verse 28, he said, and to man he said, behold, the fear of the Lord is wisdom, and to depart from evil is understanding. Back when he speaks about his integrity, he would talk about the man that has hatred is a liar, and the man that is filled with scorn is a fool. And Job says, I have played that part. Not that he's lost his integrity and lied, but he said, I played that part of the fool whenever I scorned and I complained against God. But here Job ultimately recognizes the great fear of God. Look in chapter 28 and verse 12. But where can wisdom be found, and where is the place of understanding? And really that's what happens when God begins to speak. As I said in the beginning, chapter 29 is a reference to the good old days. In chapter 30 is a reference to the bad old days. And now in chapter 31 and beginning and going forward, God says, okay, Job, you've had your time. Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar, you've had your time. You've had your time to speak. And now you stay silent for a while. Now it's my time to speak. And what I want to know is this. Did I ask your opinion about how I ought to arrange things? In fact, Paul will echo those very same words in Romans chapter 11, verses 33 and 34, when he says, who can search out wisdom to know the excellent things of God? Did God take you into his counsel? Who is man? Who is man to sit in the seat to judge God? Who is man to sit in the seat to complain against God and say, God, you did this wrong, you did this wrong, you did this wrong? God said, were you there, and did I ask your opinion about how I ought to arrange things? Did I ask your opinion when I drew the horizon with my finger? Did I ask your opinion when I cast the stars in their place? Did I ask your opinion when I caused the sun to shine, the moon to put in its place? Did I ask your opinion when I created you? Did I ask your opinion about how you ought to be created? And so Job speaks in chapter 28 and verse 12 and says, and where can wisdom be found, and where is the place of understanding? Man does not know its value, nor is it found in the land of the living. The deep says, it is not in me, and the sea says, it's not in me. It cannot be purchased with gold, nor can silver be weighed for its price. It cannot be valued in gold. It is precious and onyx and sapphire, neither gold nor crystal nor are its equal, nor can it be exchanged for jewelry of fine gold. No mention shall be found of coal or quartz, for the price of wisdom is above rubies. The topaz of Ethiopia cannot equal it, nor can it be valued in pure gold. We may not understand onyx and sapphire, we may not understand topaz, but we understand rubies and we understand gold. And what he's saying of greater value than all that is wisdom. And he said, what we need to do in wisdom is to trust in the Lord and lean on his ways. And he will direct our steps. Job has learned this. Job has learned that the essence of revelation is at last to know God. And the essence of life that is lived successfully is to have a relationship with God. And Job has yearned for that relationship. It's not the process of revelation that's important. It's the byproduct of revelation that's important. And the byproduct of revelation is that we shall seek, we shall grope, and we shall know God. That's our purpose. Paul will speak those very same things to the Athenians. That they should seek and they should grope in hope that they would know the Lord. And here Job is speaking as one who finally sees that wisdom comes from God. And he seeks and understands that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. And that's where we really begin to learn who God is. And that's where we begin to learn about our relationship with God. And that's where we begin to understand the process of revelation is to bring us to Him. And that's what Paul will say in Philippians chapter 3. His only hope and desire is that to know Him and the power of His resurrection and to be partaker of His sufferings. And to finally be apprehended, to be captivated by that which God has laid hold of him, to press toward the mark that he might receive the prize, the upper calling of God in Christ Jesus. The ultimate, he says, is to know the Lord so that I can be like him. And Job says, I have in the end spoken like a foolish man. Because why? I did not know the wisdom of God. And the question is that our purpose? Is that what we're seeking to know? Now, leaving my template of 3 points, it's hard to work in 8 and give 5 to 10 minutes to each one and us have some time left for the rest of the morning. So here's the overview. Now I'm back to my question that I asked in the beginning. How would you describe God's ideal man? The question came from somebody. Somebody wanted to know, what is a man? Hey, how do you define a man? Well, Are we going to define a man like the world defines a man? Well, a man obviously has to be masculine in gender. That kind of is a given, right? It's kind of hard to find a man feminine gender, though some seem to think they can be that way. The feminist movement has done a number on our minds. The movement toward equality to dumb us all down in our genders has affected us. And unless we think it has not affected the church, we got blinders on. The question today is, what are the role of women? It's throughout the religious world. It's throughout the Lord's church, both conservative and liberal. What's the role of women? And the role of women is being expanded to be the role of men because we can't tell the difference between a man and a woman. We can't. Do we not know what our gender is? Do we not know when God made man, He made man, and when He made woman, a woman to be a woman, and a man to be a man? That doesn't take a perfect score in your SAT to be able to discern that. So how would you describe a man? A boss? Fierce? Intimidating? Moody? A man who rules with an iron fist? Someone you don't cross? Someone you don't question? Someone who brings home the bacon and tells you how to cook the bacon? Someone who keeps that checkbook and monitors every check that's written out of the checkbook and watches every mile on the odometer and questions every mile that's been put on the odometer. Why did you do this? They have to tell the woman every step she has to take and every breath she has to make, and if she doesn't do that, then she falls under his condemnation. How does the world? Isn't that how the world largely looks at a man? A man is free to lust with his eyes. He doesn't have to remain pure. A man doesn't have to keep his covenant with his wife or his promises. A man doesn't have to remain pure and chaste. It's the woman that has to stay home. It's the man that can pursue the woman. It's the man that can be impure, and the woman has to remain pure. And if she doesn't, then she's the one that's put out, because it's expected of men. It's simply expected of men. They can't restrain themselves. It's simply expected of men that they're going to wander. It's simply expected of men that they're going to be unfaithful to the wife, but the wife is expected to be faithful to him. And by the way, do they really have to be thoughtful of others? Why would you want to treat others thoughtfully? Why would you want to treat others truthfully? If you have to bend the truth, by the way, to get your way, and in the process of life, you simply grind somebody under your heel, why would you do that? And to be considerate of the poor and your enemies? Is that the way the world works? No, the world says, if they're your enemies, you squash them. I think of how he dealt with his enemies, and I think primarily of his wife, Mrs. Job there. I mean, here a woman is created to be his helpmeet. And she at this time becomes his curse, not his blessing. Because she says, curse God and die. Well, maybe we've been a little hard on Mama Job. Because in the end, he gets 10 more children, but it never says in the end he got another Mama Job. You ever notice that? But we want to be hard on Mama Job to say, well, she should have just bucked up. She said, curse God and die. Listen, this woman's lost a lot. There's not a woman that's here today that would not have mourned the very things that she mourned. I mean, okay, you can lose the oxen, you can lose the goats. That's really not going to affect a woman a whole lot, I don't think. Except for the fact it provided for a way of life. Lose the house, that may be more significant. Lose the children, that's everything. And now then, the man upon whom you lean for your strength becomes so loathsome, you wish for him to die, curse God and die. I mean, this woman has not been hit in the solar plexus, she's been hit in the heart of her soul. She has lost absolutely everything, and she has lost her foundation. She has lost her morals. She has lost her emotions. She has lost her feelings. She has lost her heart. But could it also be that Job's patience and long suffering with her to say, look, sweetheart, God gave it to us when we're good, and we're going to stay there with Him when we're bad. But there's something else about the indomitable strength of a woman that I think is highly underestimated. It's highly underestimated by men, I think. And a woman has an indomitable strength to her. Yes, she may falter and she may stumble at the beginning when she's hitting the very heart and soul of her being because she's lost her children, now she's lost her husband. But women have a strength, they have a steeliness, they have a resolve to them that in the end they will get their feet under them and they will stand by their man and help him in his most weak moment. And here's this man in his weakest moment, and in the end, she rises to stand by him and not be his enemy, but by his patience and by his long suffering, by the covenant he made to her to keep his promises in spite of what was going to be bad. He made his covenant to keep his eyes pure with her. She knows she can trust in him. She knows that he will keep his word and keep his promise to her regardless of how bad it gets. And in the end, she rises and she stands with him. Why? Because he is a man of God. And he is God's man. And when we think about God's man, we think about someone who's gentle and forbearing. We think about a man today. Do we think gentle and forbearing? Do we think of someone that's selfless and free from vengeance, or someone that's harsh, and someone that's demanding or listen? First time, shame on you. Second time, shame on me. You'll take advantage of me once, but you'll not take advantage of me twice. And the next time, it's going to be in your face, not mine. That wasn't how Job dealt with this. And he was the spiritual leader of his family. Or do we turn that over to our wives? How would you describe God's ideal man? Well, let's sum this up. First of all, he is the example for men in leadership, totally selfless leadership. Always leading for the benefit of the one led. He has been delegated that role of leadership for the good of those he leads. Being a man is not for his benefit. Being a man is for the benefit of those who have been delegated to his charge. And it is not a man, it is not one who is a man that is selfless, that is selfish, and serves for his own good and expects others to bow to his every whim. That's not God's man. Second of all, he is the model for his wife, for his family, for his church and community because he has submitted himself to the Father. And in doing so, he takes on the responsibility, not being boss, but being a submissive servant. Submitting to the good of his wife, submitting to the good of his family, submitting to the good of his community, submitting to the good of his Lord. He brings himself not as a totalitarian, not as a despot. He brings himself, submitting himself to God and therefore bowing himself to the service of others. He is not the man that stands as a rogue that says, all is for me and I'll parcel out what you get. He is the man who serves ultimately bowing for the good of others. And by the way, when God incarnate came, He was the perfection of what being a man is. Because with integrity, with humility, with a God-fearing attitude, He came and He gave Himself for others. God's man is a man who truly worships God, a man who, in fearing God, leads others to Him. And men, we're not going to be men, God's men. We may be masculine in gender, but we will not be God's men. And will not be men as God defines a man if we're not the example in selfless leadership. If we do not set the example for our family, and if we fail to take our responsibility serious. What is a man? Job is God's ideal man. Men, I don't know about you, but I've got a lot of work to do. At this time, we'll have a prayer, and then we'll have a song.